Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Podcast. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're joined by Jonathan Rao. Jonathan, thanks for being here, man.
Hey, thanks for inviting me, Chris and Nikki. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we're definitely excited to chat with you. You and I have exchanged comments and memes and, everything in between over the last several years on LinkedIn. But for folks that don't know you, your content, your thought leadership on things like, SecDataOps and so on, who are you and what are you up to?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jonathan Rao. I'm originally from the Bronx, New York. Right now, I'm the VP Distinguished Engineer at Query. I've been a board advisor there. I'm also a board advisor at Phoenix Security. Previous to this, I've been everywhere, man. I've been in the Army, I've been in NBC, I've worked in healthcare, I've been a contractor, a PM, I worked at IHS Market, I worked at AWS. I was at Lightspin before we got bought by Cisco, and now I'm here at Query doing federated search stuff. Yay.
Awesome. So you have some experience. Yeah, just a little bit of experience.
You could say that.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious because your role right now, I know you said, VP and distinguished engineer. I'm curious, with your focus on cloud security, and we were talking about SecDataOps, what does being a distinguished engineer mean? What kind of work do you do? Do you work on research or what does a distinguished engineer role look like?
Sure, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm kidding. So, if you follow like a typical DE, what Cap One or GitLab says, it's senior IC. Unless you have a fellow, then you'd be below them. But typically, it's the most senior IC. I'm on the E team, hence the VP title. And really, I see myself as kind of a chief tiebreaker, really. I do have a lot of expertise, so-called expertise, across a bunch of different domain areas: cloud security, networking, ITFM, FinOps, data engineering and whatnot. So I'm able to use that as well as my previous experience as a CISO, as a technology PM, as a technical product manager, as a product owner, things like that, to be able to kind of pitch hit depending on what we're doing, and also kind of keep everybody honest. Not that they don't know what their job is, but when I'm meeting with design and product, it could be like, oh, hey, this actually isn't really capable on the engineering side, or, oh yeah, actually this works on the back end. All we need to have is a front end for it. And same thing for engineering. If the time comes, oh, what's product doing? What are they smoking? I'm like, no, here's why we're building it. It's for the customer. Here's the sort of thing. So there is a research element. There is an evangelism element, kind of, about, really preaching the good word about what the customer needs are. And then there's just kind of the fun part of being an engineer, right? Being able to dive deep in the technology, being able to work in things. Our co-founder, Duraj, is focused really on kind of like 12 months down the pipe, right? He's almost like a chief futures officer, you would say, in R&D space. Then obviously product is focused on this quarter and next. I kind of get to play somewhere across that continuum. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a couple questions actually about, security and data. Obviously, you've had a lot of focus there lately. You really have established yourself as kind of a thought leader on this front. And we've seen the discussion, around data and security kind of evolve from, legacy environments with like a SIEM SOC centralized approach, oriented around collecting all the things, got to collect everything, all the things, and now there's discussions around data lakes and analytics and automation. Can you discuss that evolution a little bit with us? And what are your thoughts on, where things are headed?
Yeah, for sure. Right now, I feel like we're on the precipice of something. Despite all the new technologies, lakes, lake houses, warehouses, graphs, and whatnot, I still feel like we're deferring as an industry, but we're like getting there. I mean, if you look at the beginning, right? And I only turned 30 a couple of weeks ago, right? So I wasn't like there in data centers. I was a kid, right? But early technology, right, was small capabilities, castle moat or star fortress, depending on your industry and I guess what part of the medieval period you're in, right? If you understand that reference. Is kind of the defense and debt mechanism. It's, hey, we got to protect our edge. We have firewalls. We have AVs delivered for us for DOS systems and early Windows 2000 systems on floppies. And I probably still have a bunch of those at my parents' house somewhere, right? Like that's what it was. So it was all about just finding skilled people to run that stuff, because it was not really new. I mean, you go back and look at papers in the 60s and 70s, but security, central security, like tangible security, right? Like what we think of when you log in a Wiz or a Sneak. That wasn't really a thing. It was a bunch of busybodies running around with floppy disks and patch cables, getting into routers, getting the firewalls and whatnot. So the first step was really that kind of config management centralization, if you would, just to make it easy to actually apply security. Then, is it Moore's law where compute becomes better and cheaper? One of those laws, virtualization, opens up to a lot of different people. Now, all of a sudden, I'm running 12 servers where I used to run one. That increases, tenfold your work that you have to do. And then that was kind of the focus of centralizing that. And then it was, okay, now we have a lot of tools. We've got firewalls, we have forward proxies, we have reverse proxies, we have this, we have Kerberos, we have Shibboleth, we have AD logs. Then that's where the first sort of tech you see, like Apache Lucene, right? Like rich text search, index-based search, that laid the groundwork for the first SIMs, like the ARC sites of the world and whatnot. And then as virtualization evolved into cloud computing, more capabilities, more environments to secure, more tools, and then centralization became just a little bit harder. And now I feel like we're over that second centralization hump. Now we have cheap storage up the wazoo. I mean, $23 a month for a terabyte. You could fit a lot of stuff in a terabyte. I mean, with ZTLB encryption and ORC or Avro or Parquet, you could fit like a literally eye-bleeding amount of log data and config data in it. So now where we're at is, okay, we have cheap storage, but we're not really changing how we do security. It's still the same detection, still the same analysis, still the same visualization. We just put it in different places. To me, functionally, there's no difference than having BI sitting on top of materialized views in Snowflake versus just going to like a security hub or a sneak to do whatever it is you're doing. I'm looking for exploit data. I'm looking for tradecraft. I'm looking for sign-ins on MFA because that's a big deal, right? Whatever it is. So I think we're deferring right now about what we're going to do. We're just moving a lot of data. We're storing a lot of data, but I'm still waiting for the usage. And that's not to offend the XDR and the CNAPs and whatnot. There are capabilities who are adopting to this new way of how we store and move data, but we still haven't revolutionary changed where we're at. So that's what I'm kind of waiting for, right? And poking people in the eye.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you, you talked about the evolution, but you talked about in some ways how not a lot has changed. I've been reading a lot of pieces lately around security data, and there's been kind of this mantra that there isn't security data, quote unquote. There's just business organizational data, some of which has security context and use. I'm curious your thoughts on that. It seems to be in line with the push for, security being more tightly coupled with the business, speaking the language of the business. What are your thoughts on that mantra? Is it accurate, or is it just kind of a play on words?
That's straight up garbage. I'm sorry. Well, actually, no, I'm not sorry. That is straight up garbage. Look, security data is security data. The business, you're there to serve their purposes, right? Like at the end of the day, the people who are running these billion-dollar P&Ls, they know how to run businesses. So they're, hiring security people, or they're allocating budget, or they're charging back to the central security function. They're trusting your judgment, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So to say that, I don't know, I guess you could, if you're not seeing things through their logical conclusions, you'd be like, oh, well, I work in a business and I'm in security and I have data that data's in the business. So therefore security data is business data. No, I get that there's this desire for tight coupling and having security people on boards and CISOs answering to boards and, different things. It depends on your regulatory environment. I think that might pass the sniff test somewhere, depending with the right people and the right board and the right CEO. But no, security data. Security has always had a data issue. And in a lot of ways, we are the data issue, right? Where it's just like, we got to have all the things. I got to have all the schemas. I got to have all the columns, all the rows, all the tables. And then when you stop and be like, oh, time out, pal. Why? What are we doing? What tradecraft are we looking for? What are we looking to prevent? What are we looking to detect? What performance management metrics do we have laying on top of this? So we put in SIM. So that was a long way to say that's no, just no.
Yeah, honestly, I kind of agree with you. I think it's like it downplays the importance of data for security purposes, and as you talked about, the different types of logging and telemetry, the things you laid out, the business doesn't care about most of those things, the business peers. This is really stuff that's critical and important to security, and it is security data for a reason, not that it doesn't belong to the business, but they just have no interest in digging into that data.
Exactly.
Yeah, I wanted to, since we're talking about logging, which is one of my favorite topics, especially when we're talking about incident response. And I saw you were posting recently about the AWS incident response planning that they have. They have sort of a good guide there. But I'm curious, when we're talking about logging guidance, especially in these very complex environments, right? Like we've got these massive development environments. You might have multiple cloud environments or, infrastructure that's being moved from, on-prem to cloud. So where can people kind of start, right? Like we're talking about terabytes and maybe petabytes of data. So where should people start? What do they need to log? Because I think sometimes it's like, oh, we'll just log everything, right? But that's not always like the best strategy. So
yeah, no, it's and shout out to AWS, man. I mean, I remember back like learning cloud in 2014 and 15, there was like hardly anything out there. Now they got these thick white papers full of prescriptive guidance. It's great, and it's what the customer wants. So shout out to all the SAs and TAMs that work on that. As far as where to start, so I'm always a big fan of like working backwards from the minimum necessary, right? You take the old military adage of like priority intelligence requirements, whether you're pre-shaping a battlefield or whether you're trying to get like actual material intelligence for targeting ops, whatever you're going to do with that targeting, there's always different bits and pieces, right? It's like, oh, we need some, we need IMIT, the IMIT shop to look at it. We need SIGINT, we need ELIT, we need whatever intel shops. It's almost, I don't want to say it's the same. It's definitely not the same stakes in cybersecurity, despite what we like to tell ourselves. We're saving lives. Like, no, not an Avenger movie, bad security person. Get back to the sim. But for me, it's setting what those PIRs are, right? It's like, almost starting from the beginning. You have to start at the beginning, at the end simultaneously, where it gets confusing. The beginning being brass tacks. What's our business? What's our regulatory environment if we have one? What's our compliance environment if we have one? What do we do, right? Are we building IoT sensors that we put on gas valves? Are we building rocket boosters? Are we building simulations for rockets? Are we a construction company? Are we working at commercial real estate? Are we doing post-trade compliance and running, millions of securities across our desk, a minute, right? So a lot of that will kind of shape where you go next. It's like, all right, based on that, based on the users, the population, the density, where they are, geographically, if they're in an office, if they're remote, if there's geopolitical things at hand, levers, movers, or the people on risk lists, or about to do layoffs, like all that kind of business context, then it's like, all right, you have that enterprise risk management layer on top of that, where it's like, okay, here's what the business cares about from risk. And then here's like the 10% that matters to security, that security could influence. And then what are the levers we could pull? What are the things we could put in place that of the threat communities, threat families, or just, salient threats that are related tangentially or directly to that risk? What do we want to stop and what can we? And then you set the PIRs of like, all right, this threat family would use this tradecraft. We're worried about MFA. We're worried about password spraying. We're worried about lateral movement, golden ticket punching, people dumping LSAS, people freaking, crash dumping and hooking our EDR because our EDR is on top of these super secret, super special things. Then you pick the log sources. So that was a really long way. And you do that all the time. I'm not saying that you have to do that full exercise, but you pick it based on tradecraft. You pick it based on PIRs. Now, sure, you could cheat a little bit. And I would say that, yeah, if you're on the cloud, flow logs probably are going to matter. Maybe not to security, they're going to matter to somebody. So maybe capture them all. That's not a big deal. DNS, anything at your edge, right? Especially if you're going through having WAFs or any type of firewall, stuff like that. I think you could mostly get away with just logging it. Maybe down the road, you have to trim it up a bit. But any specialized appliance, specialized tool, like you better have a good reason to actually collect that data and have a demonstrable way of like, all right, here are the fields, here are the things, here's a combination of fields, the federated joins, that if there's behavior there, we would see it in the logs, or if we see these logs X amount of times in this time period, that's bad. So we need to do something about it. So that's really how I think it through. And again, those big giant exercises might happen once. They probably happen when you were to get there, hopefully, whether you're a new CISO, and you're joining in, or you're coming in as a director ahead of X. Hopefully that stuff's already done. So a lot of the groundwork's done for you. But if it's not, what are you doing? Get back to work, get off the podcast.
Yeah, I think it's a good distinction around some of the core things you need to be keeping an eye on, but also, thinking about the scenario of where you are in the organization's maturity, what your role is, what the state of the organization and their landscape is as well. I wanted to ask you as well, as we watch the security data space evolve, you've been championing this concept of, you've actually written a great white paper on it. For folks that haven't check it out, about SecDataOps. I think it's the term you've used. What is this exactly? And why do you think it's time for the industry to head this direction?
Well, me, I like talking smack on the internet, not for good reason. So it began, I really don't remember where I had the idea, but I used to be like a huge DevSecOps champion, right? Like I was that guy. I was like, we're just going to put everything in the pipelines and we're just going to shift left everything. And we're just going to, we're going to stop all the stuff because we shift left. No, a couple broken things later, a couple bills getting, increased by several tens of thousands of dollars later, a couple bad metrics later. And you know, Jonathan's embarrassed, but Jonathan's humble because Jonathan's smarter now, right? So I kind of did it as a play on that, or like, oh, you know, freaking DevSecOps, like, let's just put everything in the pipeline. And I was making fun of the whole, like, let's just put everything into the lake, right? So, uh-oh. Hey, are you allowed to be here? So SecDataOps kind of just started as that. And then I was really thinking, I was like, you know, this makes sense. Because at IHS Market, when we built Cyber Risk Graph, it was our project. It was, you know, we built a better Wiz, essentially. Like, that's what we built. We built like a legitimate, like, big graph on Neptune that had all clouds, private, public, on-prem, EDR data, log data, everything was integrated. We were creating cyber risk quantification workloads off of it. We were using it for red team targeting operations. We were using it for just general purpose continuous compliance management and just hygiene and performance metrics. Like, we were using it for everything. And on that team, I had some great people that they're like, hey, what do you want to build? And we go, let's build a graph. They're like, cool, do you know how to? I was like, I don't know, let's figure it out, right? And that's kind of what SecDataOps is to me. It's like, with the security mind of everything I previously talked about picking the logs, about what's our environment, what are the material risks, what are the risks that we could influence, what are those threats, like that whole continuum of it leading to PIRs and then eventually leading to the actual work that needs to be done. Effects on target, outcomes, cool. We stop bad things from happening, sweet. I go home, I collect my check, and I do it again the next day, and hopefully nobody wakes me up at 2 a.m., right? That's where the SecDataOps is, right? That never goes away. Being an engineer, being an architect, being an analyst, having that core security, and then data, it's like, well, what are we doing? And again, going back to your earlier question, Chris, right now we're deferring. We're putting stuff in cheap storage. We're moving a lot of data. We're storing it in cool places. That it's always been there. I think security teams have always kind of pushed the envelope, right? And remember where this tech came from, right? Security people didn't come up with Apache Lucene, we just used it. Security people didn't come up with Hive, Facebook did. Security people didn't come up with Presto, they didn't come up with Iceberg, they didn't come up with Delta Lake. Like, these are business users, business DEs. We could just adapt to it, right? So it's being able to understand kind of that right tool all the way down from, like, how do I normalize a table, down to how do I manage RDBMS? Do I build a lake? When do I use OLTP versus OLAP? Like, that remedial stuff, but also making use of that data, knowing, all right, are we going to normalize? How long are we going to store it? Setting up the data contracts, having data quality, data integrity, that governance layer that oversees this, to know that, all right, from this tool and this source, we're going to get this amount of data and stream, batch, micro batch, whatever. We're going to use these mechanisms to move them. And then the ops is actually operating that, right? And I think that gets lost in a lot of these DevOps, data ops, DevSecOps. We kind of just want to do the cool stuff, and then the operational piece, you know, performance metrics on top of it, setting KPIs of the stuff you're moving and of what value you're deriving. Maybe you want to tie it to financial metrics and risk, but actually operating those data, operating these, you know, things is hard. It's expensive. It needs special skills. So really, it's having this kind of joint interagency task force, if you would, of traditional data people, data scientists, engineers, analysts, architects, governance folks, and then all the components of security kind of being in this contiguous layer of, like, all right, here's the security problems, here are the different ways that we could solve it, and then operating that and seeking value, and then having a continuous improvement cycle on top of it, where it's like, all right, maybe we don't need the graph, or maybe we have this giant lake, maybe we don't need to have another lake. There's always going to be pressure to reduce costs. There's always going to be pressure to reduce headcount to justify. I'm not saying none of that goes away, but that's really what SecDataOps is about, is like doing all three of those things really, really well and unionizing them with data smartly, which is a lot of buzzwords. So
I think you laid it out really well. And I think it's funny because at the beginning you kind of, like, you know, I don't want to say spoke badly of DevSecOps or some of the mantras of DevSecOps, but ultimately you ended up bringing together security data and operations together to make use of that data for security purposes for the organization. So I thought that was pretty cool. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is, like, you know, you've talked a lot about, you know, edge, you know, we've talked about containerization, cloud, on-prem environments, all these different compute abstractions, for example, all the different cloud native services. And all the different vendors and solutions we see in organizations. We're seeing a push now for standardized logging formats, like the open cybersecurity schema framework, which I know you've been talking about lately. And it has support, you know, from some big tech companies, of course, as well, which is really cool to see. But how important do you think it is for the industry to have, you know, the standardized cybersecurity schema framework when we come to, like, security data, logging, telemetry, those kind of things?
You know, normalization, it's helpful and it's not. In the same vein, right? It's great in that, hey, we have this mechanism of which, let's say you're starting down that quote unquote SecDataOps journey. You're past just shoveling things into a SIM. Not that you can't get value out of that, right? I think that disparagement like is just kind of, you know, it's like barstool talk, like immediately like, oh, how about sports ball, right, buddy? It's like, how about those Sims? I hate those Sims. It's like, okay, good for you. Why? Right. So the whole idea, but, you know, kind of behind the schema is having a good place to store all that value, right? Like it's a value store. It's a way that, all right, no matter where it's coming from upstream, you have kind of this, you know, unified layer where you run into issues like that anyway, right? Where Azure Active Directory might call something user ID with ID capitalized. Somebody might call it user underscore ID, right? There's that piece, but then there's also knowing what you're talking about. A user ID in one tool, right? Like let's say AWS. It could be a like AKIA, whatever that like the canonical ID you see in CloudTrail. It could refer to an ARN. It could be a username, right? So it's really about getting something in the same format for like a data integrity, data quality, but also giving the same meaning to a bunch of disparate things, whether it's coming from Kerberos logs, AD, IAM, CIEM tools, SACE tools, whatever. And I'm just talking like identity users as an example. So that's well and good. I think OCSF has a long way to go, right? It's confusing until you actually get in. And that's why I always tell people like, go out and build, like go pick a log source and try to map it. It's hard, at least for me, right? I'm not scared to admit that. Like I've been struggling for like the last 3 weeks to get ALB logs into it because I'm like, oh, that's how you use observables. Oh, that's what an extension is. That's what a profile is. That's what an object is. That's a base event class. I'm saying all this and you're probably thinking, like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Exactly. It's my point. It's when you try to boil the ocean, sometimes, you know, you get freaking deep fried. Like it's hard to do what they're doing and it's still not representative of everything. So that's where the bad stuff comes in. It's not a silver bullet where, oh, we'll just normalize this format. We'll have everything well, you know, populated, well formed. No, you're going to have a lot of unmapped fields. If you derive value from specialized log sources or things that are not well represented in OCSF, maybe don't use that. And then at the beginning, I don't know if you meant to, but you brought up Edge. I like that idea, right? If in the SecDataOps continuum, you don't have to centralize this stuff. If you can do something at the edge, if you could just straight up prevent it and not have to think about it, do that. If you could have a detection at the edge, at the system of record, at that source of truth without having to transform the log and ETL it and incur the cost, right? There's cost. It's a whole supply chain. Like every time you move that data, you pay for it somewhere, right? Like nobody's getting a free lunch here, despite the good prices we might be getting from these vendors. So push the stuff that you can to the edge, normalize what you can, but just go into it knowing that, hey, like we're going to have raw data. We still have to parse. We're still going to have to use JQ. We're still going to be using regex. We're still going to be doing silly things to derive value. But I think it was a great project. I was involved really, really early on when I had a code name, when it was just a PRFAQ in the depths of AWS external security services. Young TPM Jonathan saw it and I was like, wow, this is a really cool idea if they could execute. And they're really close with Security Lake. I really like it. And I also hate it a little bit. So yeah.
No, that's good. I was going to say SecDataOps Continuum sounds like a sci-fi show I would watch.
Oh yeah.
So I love that. No, I wanted to ask you before we sort of wrap up, can you tell us a little bit more about Query? What's going on? Can you tell us what you're working on? Anything you wanted to share?
Yeah, for sure. So Query, we're kind of willing this category federated search into existence. I mean, like I spoke about before, right? Like there's been a lot of data moving and a lot of data storing. There's been a little bit of data value. The idea is like, hey, maybe you're in a SecDataOps program, or maybe you have a project. You're moving from Splunk to Snowflake, Snowflake to Databricks, Databricks to some giant graph. Maybe you want to keep stuff close to the edge. You want to keep stuff in its system of record. That's really the idea behind Query, is that we'll plug in for you into wherever it is. It could be in Azure Active Directory or Entra ID, in the Microsoft Graph API. It could be on your Snowflake tables and views. It could be in Redshift. Well, Redshift's not ready yet, but essentially wherever it is, no matter what the format, we want to be able to connect to it. And then you're thinking like, oh, well, we still have the ETL piece. Then we're giving the users the ability to ETL it. So we'll federate. We don't store data. There's some small caching involved, obviously. We can't speed up queries for you. We're kind of as fast as you're slow as query, but we'll bring back incremental results. But we'll do that normalization layer for you. We'll have that semantic search layer for you. So if you're looking for specific tradecraft, or you're looking for a lot of things, and then eventually if you kind of want to, maybe schedule different views or have the different analytics, these are all things that we're kind of thinking of right now. But right now, the core value prop is connect to your data where it is, have, no KQL, no weird schema to learn, no weird languages to learn, right? Like, we normalize it for you. Don't worry about ETL if you don't have the skills to do it right now. You don't need to go buy an extra tool if you don't need to right now. Just connect to where it is and derive value that way. So I'm helping to kind of shape what that's going to look like down the future. I alluded to some of it. Maybe, hey, we could have a planning element. Maybe we could have a DNA element here. But then also I'm working on a ton of blog stuff on OCSF, on schema normalization, on big data ETL, around ALB, like I kind of mentioned before, and then a couple other things as well to try to get back to the community, because that's what I really like to do. I like free stuff. I write Electric Eye. It's a free CSPMS SPM tool. I'm a big fan of just, putting stuff out there, even if nobody starts up a demo instance or takes a look at query, as long as they're getting value in their SecDataOps journey, that's what I'm kind of all about. Got to get back.
Awesome. I love that. I cannot thank you enough, Jonathan, for joining us today. We talked everything from SecDataOps to what I think is going to now be a new sci-fi TV show. So no, I just want to say huge thank you for coming on and talking to us. And that'll take us out for this week, and we'll see everybody next week.
Nice.